A couple of things about the webinar just to give you an overview of what we want to accomplish today in the short period of time that we are together. One, obviously, I'll review the webinar goals, which I've already indicated to you to some degree what we hope to accomplish today. We are going to talk a little bit about the state equity plans. All of you are very familiar, many of you on the phone, that states are in the process of hopefully finalizing their equity plans to be submitted at the beginning of June. We're also going to talk a little bit about CEDAR, and some of you may or may not be familiar with CEDAR, but we will acquaint you with what the CEDAR efforts are. I know many of you are in states in which that we as CEDAR are involved in intensively, so wanted to acquaint you with them. And then also talk a little bit about some strategies around teacher and leader preparation reform that could be part of the state's equity plans if they're not already part of them. And wanted to assure that you were familiar with the Cedar Center, the work in the states that you're involved in, as well as some of the resources and tools that could be very beneficial as you're starting to support your states around their equity work. A couple of things about the way that this agenda will go. I am joined by my colleague, Alex, who is on the line, and he is a Center on Great Teachers and Leaders staff person, and I think many of you in the regional centers have likely met Alex. But Alex is on our team, our equity team for the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders, and has been really engaged in supporting the states in the development and the drafting of their equity plans. So many of you know Alex through the regional center contacts and then your engagement with states. I believe I know everyone else on this phone, and this is Lynn Holt-Heidi, as I mentioned earlier, and I get to serve two hats today. Many of you know me as the Deputy Director for the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders, and I also serve as a TA specialist or an intensive TA person within the Cedar Center as well. So I get to serve both roles today and wanted to use that role to kind of acquaint and make some connections in our state so that way we can really start to realize some of the gains and the progress that we would like to make in states. In the webinar, we will have Alex talking a little bit. I will talk a little bit as well, and then we have some polling questions. We thought we'd start with polling questions because we weren't sure how many people will be on the phone and wanted to ensure that we have a great way of getting some feedback and some input from all of you as you listen. But then we also have a Q&A where we're going to just open up the lines. We knew that the attendees would be somewhat minimal, and so that would allow us an opportunity to just have a more conversational Q&A at the end of this webinar. There will be some polling questions throughout, and I believe we'll start with the first one right now. If Whitney, if you could go ahead and put that up for us. Basically, I just wanted to get a handle on, or we wanted to get a handle rather, on why you decided to participate in this webinar. And if you see on the right-hand side of your screen, or at least I believe it's on your right-hand side, it's on mine, if you could just start selecting, and you get to choose one. Choose the one that's the most appropriate. And I'm going to give everybody a few minutes to respond. Whitney, are we close to, do we have a fair number of people who have responded?
We have 6 more people we're waiting for.
Okay, we'll give it another 15 seconds and then we'll move on. All right, Whitney, would you mind going ahead and putting up the results? So all of the above, wanting to learn a little bit more about what CEDAR is and also talk a little bit about teacher preparation. I think both of those are good. Wonderful. We had a few people who didn't answer, and there were a couple of others. I can't quite see the others. Whitney, is there something in the others that anybody indicated that you might want to share with us?
Say that one more time.
In the other field, there was an open-ended response. Are there things in there that you could enlighten us on in terms of the 4 that chose other?
No, there's no additional comments with it.
Okay. Okay, my assumption is that's part of the CEDAR staff, so it didn't quite make sense for them to do this poll. But thank you for joining. Hopefully we'll be able to hit your needs and why you decided to join the webinar. I mentioned earlier, and I don't want to reiterate too many times, but we really had a couple of objectives today. One is just to increase the general awareness around how students with disabilities are often paired with underprepared general and special education students. I don't think this is a surprise. I don't think we need to pull up all of the research and the numbers, et cetera. I think in general, we certainly are aware that students with disabilities are often in a situation where they may not have the most highly effective teachers. And there's a whole number of reasons for that. Some of it is around preparation, some of it is around retention, and some of it is around a whole host of variables. But I think it's fair to say that with this population of students, it's even more important that we have highly effective and skilled teachers to be able to work with these students. And, one of the things that Alex will talk about in a few moments is within the equity plan, students with disabilities weren't particularly called out as a demographic or an area which we needed to be concerned about or states needed to be concerned about in the equity plan. However, we all know that within a lot of the root cause analysis that's happening in states, it's not very far that you have to go digging deep into the data that you start to see students with disabilities resonating quite high in terms of being in a position where they're not necessarily always in a classroom with a highly effective teacher. We also wanted to talk a little bit about the link between teacher and leader preparation. With equity, there's a lot of talk about can we incentivize teachers differently? Can we, incentivize them? Can we pair them? What can we do to place teachers in hard-to-teach schools and hard-to-teach classrooms? But then most importantly, how do we keep them there? And, there's a lot of strategies that are out there that everyone has tried that have met some results that are positive results and others that are negligible in terms of, yes, they come into the classroom, but they don't necessarily always stay. I would contend that teachers are much more likely to stay in their classroom, one, if they feel successful, if they're feeling like they can handle and address the needs of the students that are standing in front of, and that they feel like they are prepared to do so. And the other thing I think that is critically important is to have a strong leader. I think we've heard over and over again the important role that a leader plays, as well as the role of providing a very positive working climate. Those things are critically important, and I would contend, and I think all my colleagues here on the phone with me that work on the CEDAR work would also contend that it is very important that preparation plays a large part of preparing teachers teachers and leaders in a way that they can feel successful, and really honing in what are those competencies that teachers and leaders need to have and be able to do in order to be successful in their classrooms. We also wanted to increase your awareness of CEDAR, the intensive states that we have the opportunity to work in, and then also talk a little bit about some of the resources that are available to the intensive states as well as to all states universally that could help inform and work on some of the equity work that states have identified within their plans. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Alex.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And I guess the first thing I'm going to do is, as soon as I am able to move the slides here, start by talking about some of the basic requirements of the equity plans. So as you see on the screen, there are two specific subgroups of students that are part of the requirements for the equity plans that they need to address, and three categories of teachers. And the quote that you have on your screen is from a section of No Child Left Behind, and it's sort of what underlies the requirements of the equity plans. But the main part of the identification of equity gaps must include identifying whether or not there are gaps in access to experienced, qualified, or out-of-field or in-field teachers, I should say, so to ensure that poor and minority children are not taught at higher rates than other children by inexperienced, unqualified, and out-of-field teachers. So as Lynn mentioned, the subgroup that is not included in the plan's requirements explicitly are students with disabilities. And I'll come back to that in just a second. The other part of the equity plan requirements that I thought I would highlight was the fact that not only do they have to report on these identified equity gaps, and then, of course, identify causes of these gaps through discussions with stakeholders and develop strategies to address the root causes that they've identified and the equity gaps that they observe in their data and their analysis of those subgroups of students and their access to these categories of teachers. But they also have to evaluate and publicly report on the progress that they're taking over the implementation of the plan strategies and how much they're closing these gaps they identify over the next few years. And I think this is an important part of the plan because it sets the states up for continued and ongoing action on this issue. And I think that's one of the main intentions behind this initiative, was to ensure that this plan was just the beginning of a process of improving equitable access for students in states all around the country. So I thought that was an important thing to note. And now I'm going to come back to that point that I made about the fact that students with disabilities are not included as a required subgroup in the plan in plan requirements. I think it's one common finding in the research that I think is important to note is that minority students are found to be more likely than white students to be identified as having a learning disability. I think this is a pretty consistent finding in the literature. And I think there's also a common finding that there's overlap between students in poverty and minority students. And I guess the point that I want to make, the general point, is that it's not, I don't think it would be a stretch to say that these different groups of students in poverty, minority students, and students with disabilities, for whatever reason, tend to overlap. And so when you're examining the access that students in poverty and minority students have to excellent teachers and those three categories that I mentioned, I think it makes good sense and is worth noting that you would also be likely looking at a part of the population of students with disabilities, and that the issues of inequity those students face are very intertwined with the inequity that minority students and students in poverty may be facing. That's a connection I wanted to make. And then I also wanted to suggest that as with students in poverty and minority students, students with disabilities are less likely, and this is a common finding again in the research, are less likely to have access to great teachers and leaders. And I think that that shouldn't be surprising given the overlap of those three groups of students. And I just, again, and maybe I'm beating this over the head, but these three groups of students are often suffering from inequitable access. And so this initiative to create an equity plan to address this inequitable access for students in poverty and minority students is very intertwined with initiatives to address inequitable access for students with disabilities. So I also wanted to give a quick overview of some of the tools that the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders that we've developed to help build capacity in states to develop these plans, and then once the plans have been submitted, possibly to be helpful in the implementation of the plans in the future. We really organize these resources around the three main components of the equity plan requirements: the stakeholder engagement requirement, the requirement to review data to identify the equity gaps, and the root cause analysis that's required to identify the causes of the observed equity gaps. And then we have a fourth tool that's moving toward equity tool, kind of a collection of strategies, which really is part of the final step in the process, which is identifying the strategies to address the root causes and to close the equity gaps. So I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A about details of these different tools, and some of you on the call may be familiar with these already, so I don't want to take too much time with this. But if you have questions, definitely let me know in the Q&A at the end of the webinar. And the last thing I wanted to talk about before I pass it back over to Lynn was where states are today, and just give a quick snapshot of what we've found as we worked with states in this process as we're getting closer to the deadline on June 1st. Generally, I would say that, first I would say approximately 12 states have completed a draft plan review, and I actually think this number's increased a bit since very recently there's been more reviews, I believe, and so this may be a larger number. But a number of states have definitely engaged in this process of having their draft plans reviewed by experts. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we find that most states, and I would actually say generally it's likely none, if maybe one or two, but very, very few, if any, states are thinking about this as a exercise in redistributing educators. They're really focusing on strategies to recruit, retain, and develop educators and encourage greater access rather than forced redistribution or something akin to that. I think that's an important point to bring up. The other thing I wanted to focus on in terms of the status of states right now is the inclusion of strategies around educator preparation programs. I know Lynn mentioned that this is an important possible policy lever for improving equitable access. And I think it's actually also found to be, at this point, we've seen a common strategy or type of strategy that states are including in their plans. And I also would say that throughout the process, states have been engaging, many states have been engaging with their educator preparation program representatives and using this process of engaging with them and including them and collecting input and gathering feedback from these representatives to inform on the root causes and the strategies that they identify. And especially, I would say, the strategies that relate to improving and strengthening alignment between the needs of the school districts and the state and the educator preparation programs in their state. So they're very much a part of this process, and I think that's an important point to note. And I think at this point we've got a poll that's going to be posted, and I'll also pass it back over to you, Lynn.
Thanks, Alex. I really appreciate that. You will see a poll, and Whitney will be putting it up. You see it on both the PowerPoints, and then you see it on the side of your screen so you can participate. Sometimes, if you're like me, the side of the screen is a little bit harder to read. But just from your perspective and what you know in the states that you're working in, and I'm going to encourage our CEDAR staff who are also on the phone to go ahead and participate in this if they are aware of it. But, from what you know, our teacher and leader preparation policy and practice within state equity plans. And we'll give a few minutes for you to respond to that. And actually, I think the polling question that is up, Whitney, is the incorrect one. Could you pull the one that just has from what you know, has your state included improvements? As Whitney's working on that, I did want to make an important note that Alex brought up. Equitable distribution was the term that was used many years ago in 2006 when states were really engaging in the equitable distribution work. And I think what you found was a huge distinction in not now called equitable distribution, but equitable access. Because I think what we've learned in the field that it's really hard to distribute teachers accordingly, but really we need to focus on, like we mentioned before and like Alex mentioned, really on efforts of retaining teachers and recruiting them into classrooms and not necessarily moving them from building to building. Whitney, I still see, I don't know if everybody else still sees it, but I still see the other question up on the screen. I'm going to go ahead and flip through this question and we can have a discussion a little bit later. But if you would want to just check out the rest of the polling questions going forward, that would be great. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Cedar Center. You heard me say Cedar Center, and probably many of you are wondering what does that even stand for. CEDAR stands for Collaboration for Effective Educator Development, Accountability, and Reform Center. CEDAR was funded and is funded by the Office of Special Education Programs, and it's a 5-year funding opportunity. We began this project in January of 1st, 2013. The University of Florida is what we call the prime on the project, and Mary Brownell, who I know is also on the phone here today with us or on the webinar, is the director of that center, and there are a number of partners that are involved in that center, one of them being the American Institutes for Research. They also are partners with Kansas University and a number of other entities as well. And the reason that the center was in existence is basically to try to really start to work on some improvements in strategies around taking a look at teacher and leader preparation. And oftentimes when people hear CEDAR Center, what I will continually hear is, oh, that's a special ed initiative. And while it is about students with disabilities, I will contend and continue to contend that it is not a special ed initiative, because really what CEDAR is about is working on teacher and leader preparation reform such that all teachers and leaders that exit preparation programs and enter into our classrooms feel more prepared and have the skills necessary to be effective with all different types of students in their classroom, but in this particular context, students with disabilities. And that's what this is exactly about. This grant kind of came from grants that were happening at the university levels, where the universities, the preparation programs, really sat down and started to revise their curriculum to ensure that those what we call evidence-based practices or high-leverage practices or practices that we know can move the needle for students with disabilities were well integrated within the coursework and the field experiences, so that way when teacher candidates exited, they felt more prepared to work with our students. We consistently hear and have, and I hope that I don't hear it in another 10 years, but for the last 20 to 30 years, we consistently hear that teachers, most particularly general ed teachers, don't feel prepared to support our students. And so that's what this is about. How can we work at the practice and the policy level to make a change there? You see our CEDAR mission here, and I think the important thing to emphasize here is the aligned professional learning systems with the opportunity to learn. I think that it's not a surprise, and it's fair to say that it's really hard in 4 years' time or whatever period of time that you're able to work with teacher candidates, that they're going to know everything that they need to know when they get out. So you really have to think about opportunities for them to learn and hone their skills over time. And when we say opportunities to learn, and this is, a big concept that is resonating through the College and Career Ready standards and a lot of our work, but the opportunities to apply what they've learned. Listening to what the practice should be like is, as we know, not going to get the skills to a level of being competent in a classroom, or confident, I should say, in a classroom. And you really need to have multiple opportunities to practice the skills, to be provided coaching and feedback, to watch it being modeled to you, to hear feedback from your peers. All of those things that we know will really help move the needle for students and really change practice. Changing practice is not an easy thing to do, and what CEDAR's mission is to do is to try to take a look at the systems across the board and to ensure that we give these opportunities and have some consistent expectations from pre-service to in-service in teachers' practice, and that we're able to support them adequately. One of the things that's nice about this project is that we not only focus on practice, I mentioned before, really taking a look at program reform at the teacher and leader preparation level. How are you revising your coursework and your field experiences to afford all candidates an opportunity to really hone their skills in these evidence-based practices, but then scaling that up. What is it that we need to do at a statewide policy level that enable or create an infrastructure, if you will, that really foster the teaching and the learning and the reinforcement of those skills over time? So taking a look at licensure, how does licensure and certification come into play here? How does performance assessments that are being utilized really help reinforce the skill levels that all teachers need to work and support students with disabilities? And also taking a look at program approval. What are the program approval processes the state has put into play to ensure that any preparation program, whether it be teacher or leader or special or general ed, really set out an expectation of skill level and experience that are being taught and acquired throughout their experiences within the program. How are we making sure that program approval processes looks at that, as well as outcomes? With the HEA reauthorization and some of the verbiage that's going on right now in terms of teacher and leader preparation accountability, taking a look at outcomes. How are our teachers faring? How are the students that are being taught by the candidates that exited programs, how are they doing? What does their student growth look like? How do the teachers' practice look? What are the supervisors saying when they come out of the preparation program about their skill level and working with students with disabilities? So those are things that, as a Cedar Center, we are working with to try to help work with states and help inform that work. Many of you have heard this term, intensive, targeted, and universal, and I wanted to just take a moment to describe what that means. And this is terms that are used by the Office of Special Education Programs quite frequently, and it is just basically the level of technical assistance that's provided to states. I'm going to start on the bottom of the pyramid here, and universal, which I think is pretty self-explanatory, but that's the type of services that are available to all states that are part of this, or all states in the country here, and you are able to access in universal ways any access to our website, our materials, our resources, and our tools. So even if you are a regional center that is not happen to be part of the intensive states that we're working with in CEDAR, you would still be universally available to the resources and the tools that I'm going to show you here momentarily. Targeted is providing more targeted assistance, a little bit more targeted than universal, but it's not one-on-one that's going to last forever. It might be one-on-one. We might come out and do a training or do some facilitation, working with a group full of stakeholders around this issue, but we're not going to be necessarily engaged for a long period of time. And then there's intensive, where I say we're a partner. We work side by side with an SEA for a period of time to help them work on those issues that I mentioned earlier. You can see here that where we are intensely involved with and where we are in states on a targeted way. And you might see and you might be confused and you'll say, well, why are there some states that are both in intensive and targeted? We're kind of in the middle of switching states from intensive into targeted, or from targeted into intensive rather. And so that's why you see some dual representation here. But as I mentioned before, where you see the orange, where we're working intensely, as I mentioned earlier, we've been working with states since January of 2013, and some states we've been working with at that point, but every 5 years we take on another, or every year we take on another 5 states in the cohort. And so with those states that are orange presently, that is where we are working side by side with the state, and I'll describe a little bit more of what that looks like. Many of you on the phone here, as I look at the participant list, are regional centers in some of those states that are orange, and or regional center staff that represent, or the state liaison to the ones that are in blue as well. And I think it's important for you to be familiar with what the Cedar Center is and our tools and resources, so that way we can come together to coordinate our efforts in our TA, not around equity as well as around teacher and leader preparation reform. In all of our states, I'm just sharing this, that we work with intensively, we do have a state leadership team. One of the nice things about the opportunity that we have with CEDAR is the way that we're engaging with states. Oftentimes the client or the interface that we're working with states is the SEA, or it might be the district. In this one, we bring all parties together. So not only are we working with the SEA, and we're not just working with the special education director, we're working with the superintendent. We might be working with the district, the director of certification and licensure. We might be working with the director who's in charge of program approval. We might be working with the educators who are leading the educator evaluation efforts. So you have SEA representatives that's broad scale. It's not just special ed, but it's intended to be broad scale for all student populations. We also, as part of the grant requirements, when the state submitted an application to get intensive services from CEDAR, we asked for them, they needed to have 3 IHEs, or teacher preparation programs, that submitted the application with them. So in all of our states, we have at least 3 universities or preparation programs that are partners in this work. In some cases, we have more. In fact, in one state, we have 7 preparation programs that have engaged in this work. And when we say preparation programs, again, we're not talking about just programs that train special education teachers. We're talking about programs that train both general and special education teachers, as well as leaders within their university. So we have that, and then we also have district representation, because we want to make sure that the policies and the work that this group is undertaking really represent the needs in the field, and have some good feedback and input from teachers that are in the classroom, district superintendents, et cetera. As you can quite imagine, the policies and the work that I've discussed earlier that are part of CEDAR really cut across the scope of all stakeholders and have an impact on the stakeholders, the teachers in the classroom, the way that they're certified, the way that they're trained. It has an impact on the preparation programs, and it also has an impact on the district administrators in terms of, who they hire, and if when they do hire, they have the competent staff that they'll be able to get. Within all of our states, we develop a blueprint with the state, and this is very similar to the process that Alex outlined earlier, in that we do a root cause analysis. We do a deep dive, taking a look at the data, looking at existing initiatives that are already undergoing in the state, making sure that we have a good representative group of stakeholders who are involved in this work, taking a look at student data, taking a look at candidate performance data once they get out, really starting to take a look at all of the data, just very similar to what you would do in the equity plan, and then also focus in on, where is it that we need to exert our energies the most? Is it around performance assessments as part of the certification process? Is it around licensure? Is it around certain content area like reading and math that we're starting to see that students with disabilities or all students are really struggling? So we walk through a very similar process of what the states have walked through with the equity plans, and in some cases we've been able to merge that with the equity plan work that's already gone on in terms of the root cause analysis or with other strategic analysis that states have already done. But as a result of that, the state walks away with a blueprint with their partners. It's not just about the SEA, as I mentioned before. There's certain roles that the universities will play. There's roles that each of the state departments might play in this work. So we walk away with a blueprint that clearly articulates what the goals and the vision is for this group, and then starts to account for who's going to be doing what and how are we going to move this process along. One of the big things about CEDAR is that we focus on the evidence. What is the evidence-based practices for teachers and leaders? You heard me say that before, but I can't underscore that enough. You know, we do know with research what is moving and working with some of our students, and as you look at the continually growing achievement gap, and you look at what teachers are giving us as feedback that they're really struggling and working with this population of kids, we really need to focus on these evidence-based practices and ensure that those are, again, integrated within the preparation programs and within the expectations from pre-service to in-service. And that's why it's really important that this doesn't just become a special ed thing, or this doesn't just become an individual university or preparation program thing. This has to be broader scale in order for it to work. We've been talking about trying to change the way that teachers are prepared for a long time so that they can feel successful in the classroom. And we know that teachers have a wide range of diversity in their classrooms today. So we really have to start thinking about what are those essential practices that we know can help teachers be successful, and how are we ensuring that those are in there. And the only way to do that is really to look at the evidence. What is the evidence that we have that shows that this type of practice does work? And then how do we articulate that all the way back? How do we start to take a look at how they're being taught that in a preparation program, and then do they have opportunity for practicing it? Are their field experiences very strategic and deliberate? Do they have an opportunity to practice these evidence-based reading practices, and so that they can take these non-readers and move them so that they can be proficient at grade 4? What type of supports are set up and expected in that process? And then you take a look at certification and licensure. In our performance assessment, is there an expectation that all teachers need to know how to use these evidence-based reading practices well before they are certified to be in our classrooms? I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tools and resources that are available through CEDAR that I think are incredibly helpful and could be valuable to your state. So if you're sitting as a regional center and you're thinking, I'm not sure where this applies to me. I'm great to hear about CEDAR, but how does this fit into the work that I'm doing with my SEA? With my involvement with you with the GTL Center, much of your work is around, as a regional center staff, is around the equity plans, or is around the educator evaluation plans that states have undertaken in the last number of years. But I also know many of you are working in other spaces around maybe behavior and classroom management, or maybe you're working on multi-tiered systems of support and helping engage states in that, around professional learning opportunities or whatever the work is. So there's a whole range of work that you all are engaged in, and I wanted to highlight some of these resources because I think that they can be very helpful to inform some of the state's work as they're setting out to do some plans. Some of them are the knowledge development papers. I mentioned before that it's really good to be able to have a research synthesis that identifies what evidence is out there and what's working for our kids, and what do teachers need to know and be able to do. That's a conversation that we hear a lot when we're working on teacher and leader practice or teacher and leader evaluation systems. We say, what is it that teachers and leaders need to know and be able to do? And I'll be quite frank, when we do it at the standard level, it's pretty abstract. One thing that we hear quite often is all teachers need to be able to work with diverse learners. Well, what does that really mean? And I think these papers are a great way to look at the research, look at the level of evidence to know what that really means. What do teachers need to know about teaching math? What are the evidence-based practices in teaching math? And how do those work, and how do those look, and how do we teach those to our candidates in a classroom? How do we ensure that the evaluation system, when they're in pre-service and in service, reinforce that so that any data that comes out of the evaluation system can be used to help teachers grow in that practice? So that we have a number of literature syntheses on our website that do just that. If I wanted to know what's the research around teaching writing to students that struggle or students with disabilities, it's going to pull up the evidence, the level of evidence, and it's going to pull up the strategy. So those are, I think, very valuable resources for the field. Accompanying all those papers, we have what are called innovation configurations, and many of you might know them as rubrics, if you will. And you can see that up on the screen. I realize that that's a little bit small. We'll send out the PowerPoint to you as well, so you'll have it. But this is just an example of what the innovation configuration looks like across these different areas around evidence-based reading, writing, math, UDL, technology, and we have a whole litany of those that are available. But on the left-hand side, you see essential components on that first column. And down that row are these essential components. So when we looked at the literature, when our researchers looked at the literature, they pulled out what the evidence level was, and were able then to articulate in the left-hand column what is the strategy that is so critically important, or what is the component of that essential strategy that's critically important that teachers need to know and be able to do. What I like about this innovation configuration the most is the column across the top, because that's taking a look at the level of implementation and knowledge. When we look at syllabi or we look at classrooms, we say, yeah, they're learning about that, but what level are they able to apply it? We hear a lot about the need for authentic practice, and this is really starting to take a look at in our courses, in all the courses that the teachers need to take. Say I'm a general ed teacher. Do they learn about how to teach scientifically based reading instruction? And do they not only learn about it, but do they give an opportunity to apply it in clinical practice, in practice within their classrooms, in their field experiences? At what level do they get a chance to apply it, and at what level do they get feedback so that they can continue to hone that skill before they actually get into classrooms? I feel like these tools are huge for a couple of reasons. One, the left-hand column, the essential components that I mentioned, identifies those evidence-based practices. There's no searching that needs to happen. They're already identified in the papers. They're there. But I think most importantly, across the top, it really helps us focus and be strategic about the small amount of time that we really have with candidates in their preparation program. And I think that's critically important because we don't have that much time, and we have a lot for our candidates to learn before they exit. We also have what are called course enhancement modules, and these accompany the innovation configurations, but they take it a bit further. The innovation configurations that I mentioned just a moment ago are really a gap analysis tool. How do you see you're already teaching this? What does your professional learning and development look like at your school level, and at what level are you being able to teach these practices and to a level of competence? But this also, the course enhancement modules, is basically a repository of resources on that particular topic area. So in that, you will see an overview of defining what the topic area is. You'll see learning resources. You'll see video clips of experts in the field. You will see courses, specific syllabi, example best practice kind of syllabi. You will see references and resources. Basically, it couldn't be a more concise repository of resources for you. But it even goes a bit further, because I think there's a lot of resources on the web, and that's all good. But we wanted to take it a bit further so it could be real, have a lot of utility and usefulness for faculty and PD providers in the field. And for each of the topic areas, we have resources that is a professional learning module. Essentially, this is very similar to the professional learning modules that you've seen the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders put out. But it allows for a PowerPoint presentation, activities, handouts, facilitation notes, anything that we think that would be helpful as a faculty member. So in real practical terms, what this means is if I am really struggling, I'm getting data back that all my candidates that exit really struggle with classroom and behavior management. This is something that is consistently coming back through the data that's coming back and saying, when your candidates exit, they really struggle in this. Or maybe we're getting feedback from our candidates that exit or their supervisors or what have you. And then we have to start to think, well, how well are we teaching it? And what level are we allowing this application? And then you would say, okay, so we've got some gaps. We're not teaching it very well. We're not giving them opportunities to practice it while they're in our program. Now what? And this is the now what. This is a module that you can basically pick up and use or modify as a faculty member, as a PD provider, that basically walks you through what you would need to know about classroom and behavior management, aligned back to that evidence that I talked about earlier. They're all written in a very adult learning style where you can go in and it's not just sit and get, but there's a lot of adult learning activities that occur here to help cement what the knowledge is and the level of application and practice. I think these are huge, and as a faculty member, if I were to see that reading was really struggling when my candidates got out, that the teachers were really struggling in teaching how to learn, teaching students to read, and that my students' scores were also suffering, this is exactly where I'd go. I'd go with here because this is where the experts have pulled together all the research and pulled together activities that would be very beneficial for your students. I mentioned several of the topic areas before. You can see the content of the innovation configurations, what the topic areas are, as well as what the areas are in terms of the course enhancement modules. So again, if you were interested in classroom and behavior management, you could go on our website and be able to pull up the module, as well as all the additional resources that are available. We also have knowledge development papers around policy. So what is it that we need to know about tiered licensure? What is it we need to know about micro-credentialing, which is a term that is often being used in the field right now about ways to enhance teacher skill level while they're in the field. We'll also learn about what are the state policies around, the state standards and certification and licensure standards. As I mentioned before, in order to really make an impact on these states, we have to be able to scale up to a broader level. And these are tools that are available to help a state really look at what do we currently have going on in our teacher preparation space, and is there some areas in terms of policy that we can employ or enact within our state that will really help ensure that teachers and leaders are better prepared to work with students with disabilities. So that's a very quick run through of some of the resources that are available to CEDAR. There are tons, and it's amazing how much the center has pumped out, quite frankly, in just a few years. There are tons that are available, and some of which, can just be picked up and used right away. I think many of them are very intuitive and can be helpful for states. But if I were sitting as a regional center and I had an opportunity to work with a state on their equity plan and I'm reviewing it and providing feedback, say I see something that says, you know what, we really feel like our teachers struggle with classroom and behavior management, and that's what's keeping them. We're hearing that over and over again, that's why they're leaving their classrooms. That's the huge problem that we have in retention. They might have some strategies that generally say, we're going to work with our teacher preparation programs, or we're going to provide more PD to our teachers in an in-service way so that they can hone those skills better. These are resources that could become available and become part of the equity plan. I think that's our goal, is to be not separate outside of the equity plan and other strategic plans that are happening in the state, but really to be part of it. And so if I were sitting as a regional center person in that role, I would want to know about these kind of resources that I could bring to the state as potential resources to not only integrate in their equity plan, but really help them in the implementation of the strategies that they set out to do. I know that, Whitney, you had mentioned before that your computer was frozen, so I'm curious if we can do the poll again. Whitney, are we good with this next poll? Looks like we are. Good. So I want to hear from you who are on this phone about the very quick review I gave you of CEDAR, our efforts, and the resources. If you could tell us what way you see that the CEDAR efforts, resources, and tools could strengthen your state equity plan, and we'll give a few minutes for you to respond. As they're doing that, Alex, because I'm just looking at the time, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to get started, and we'll come back and revisit the poll in a minute.
Sounds good. Thanks. So I'm going to very briefly talk about this, and then I'll pass it back to you, Lynn. But just wanted to show this sort of visual representation of the different elements of a talent development framework that the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders has developed in partnership with others. And I think that the two key elements of this that I wanted to highlight for our conversation today are these two: prepare and develop, support, and retain. And there are a number of categories, I would say, of strategies that are mentioned. For prepare, you see the initial certification and licensure and program approval and accreditation. And then there are a number, I won't mention all of them, under develop, support, and retain. But I think that what's important to demonstrate here is that there are a number of different possible ways to develop strategies around improving preparation of teachers to eventually improve equitable access to excellent teachers, and then also develop and support and retain the teachers that are already working in the schools. And there are a number of routes and strategies to do that. So I'll pass it back over to you, Lynn.
Great. Whitney, could you put the poll up? Result? A number that didn't answer, but the integrated and the coordination, I think that's critically important, and that's one of the primary missions of what we wanted to accomplish today, is figuring out how do we integrate and coordinate the efforts within the state that we are engaged in with CEDAR, with the equity work. We have to be much more strategic. We've got a lot of work to do in our state, so that resonates. I'm glad it resonates to you all. And we'll talk about some specific steps we can do to get us there. I'm going to just close up in a couple of examples, and some of them I mentioned already to you, but some examples that are starting to percolate up in the CEDAR states, the intensive states that we have the opportunity to work in. These are examples just to kind of percolate your interest and help you think about what role this might play in the equity work, and then help make connections to your support that you're providing for your state as a regional center staff person. I mentioned the certification and licensure before. What I'm seeing start to percolate up in some of our states is the need to revise teacher and leader standards so that it's not just stating that that all teachers need to be prepared to work with diverse learners, but being a little bit more explicit in those ways, that it's trying to get language in there about the evidence-based practices, certainly looking at universal design for learning and differentiated instruction. We know that that's critically important, and those can really help set up the context in a classroom where students with disabilities could be successful. We're also starting to see percolate up revisions in licensure examinations. So as you revise your licensure standards, then you also have to take a look at how are you assessing whether a candidate knows those standards as well or not, and if they know them well enough to be certified. And obviously there's a huge trend in the field to move from your test, pencil paper kind of test to a more performance-based assessment. So we're starting to see a little bit of interest in bubbling up in terms of looking at these performance assessments and ensuring that there is some expectation of candidates before they get their license, and I'm not talking just special ed candidates, I'm talking generally in special ed, before they get their professional licensure examination, that they're able to demonstrate their ability to use UDL as a framework and also to differentiate instructions in a classroom. Around program approval, I mentioned this before, but what we're starting to see is some interest in, again, strengthening the program approval requirements for states and looking at clinical practice, making sure that there's obviously more frequent and often opportunities to be in the field. But I think in the lens of CEDAR, what we're looking for is that they have opportunities to work with a diverse range of students when they're in their field experiences. I think it's fair to say that it's highly likely that general ed teachers will have a student with a disability in their classroom or an English language learner within their classroom. So it's very important then that they have an opportunity to practice and work in their field experiences with those students, again, so they can improve their skill set. So we're seeing that as well. We're starting to see a focus on ensuring that students with disabilities and their outcomes, whether it be learning outcomes through their academics or what have you, ensuring that those are reported back to the preparing agency so that they can start to see how well are candidates doing with students with disabilities. And I think the most important thing here is that they're not just trying to think about articulating them back to the special ed teachers, but with the general ed teachers as well. If this is really about trying to improve the way teachers are able to address students with disabilities and their needs, then obviously we need to start to look at their outcomes as well and articulate them back to all teachers who have a hand in their education. I'm starting to see also in a few states that recertification is starting to be looked at as a way to leverage an opportunity to continue to grow a practice. obviously in 4 years we can't expect every teacher to be experts. I think in some more circles, particularly around the Council for Chief State School Officers, you hear the term learner ready. And knowing that the teacher does need to continue to grow and hone their skills even after they finish the prep program. So we're starting to see recertification being leveraged in a term called micro-credentialing or badging, which is something that's been in the field quite a bit. But basically that is a way to demonstrate competency in a particular skill set, so that way you can maybe have a badge. Some people think about it as an endorsement. I think those terms are all kind of convoluted, and there's some distinction in the ways that those are. But I think the important point here is that starting to think about how do we leverage that recertification process, whether it's through a micro-credential or a badge, so that there's some indeed deeper learning that happens and not just taking 3 courses to keep my certification. And then what I'm really excited to see in some state curricula is the alignment and expectations between pre-service and in-service. I think we do our field a huge disservice and our teachers when we have a difference in expectations. And teachers don't know which way to practice. So we have to make sure that however teachers are getting evaluated and supported at the pre-service level, there's similar expectations at the in-service level as well. When there's competing agendas and competing interests, it makes it really hard for a teacher to know what to do, and then most importantly, it's really hard for them to get to a level of expertise in that practice. So on the screen here, I'm not going to go through this, but I wanted to make this available to all of you on the phone that are regional centers that who our CEDAR staff are that are working in the states that you're engaged in. Many of them are on the phone here with us today, and I know would be more than welcome to entertain a phone call or an email exchange with any of your regional center staff that are working in these states. As you mentioned in the poll earlier, I think it's important for us to integrate and coordinate our efforts. So I'm going to share this, and we'll send this out to all the participants to the PowerPoint, so you have the names of all of our staff that are engaged in states. We have more than one staff, but I just listed the primary point of contact. So if you're a regional center working in Illinois, for example, Rachel, I think you're on the phone still, Rachel Trimble, if you wanted to learn a little bit about what's going on in Illinois relative to the CEDAR work, you would reach out to Stacey Rush, whose email is listed here. I also listed the state primary contacts, and I mentioned before we have a number of partners that are engaged in this work, but usually there's one primary contact that we're working with at a state. I know sometimes in the regional center world you'll ask me, well, who are you working with? And that kind of helps you position who that is and where they fit into the system. So those names are included there as well. And I'm going to stop there and allow Whitney, if you could unmute the line and see if there are questions or from the participants. You can either just say what they are as Whitney unmutes you, or you could type them into the chat box. And Whitney, can you give me a feel if they're unmuted, or do you need to unmute them if they raise their hand?
The majority are unmuted. I have about 10 more that I need to unmute.
Okay. Any questions or any thoughts?
So this is Rachel. Can you hear me?
I sure can, Rachel. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I found this very helpful. Thank you for just, organizing this. And I will follow up with Stacey just to find out how I can coordinate better the work that I'm doing in Illinois and the work that she's doing. My question is, I know the EASN, GTL, and CEDAR, there's some integration there, and I'm just wondering how much of the resources that are available that you shared here, and I know you shared some that are on the GTL Center, but could you just give me an idea of how much of the resources are the same on all 3? And
very good question. Yeah.
Very
good question. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the EASN Center, that is the Equitable Access Support Network, and that is funded through the U.S. Department of Education, through the Elementary and Secondary Ed Department. And David, I know you're on the line, so correct me if I'm speaking out of turn, but that's my knowledge of how that is funded. You also know that I mentioned before that this CEDAR grant is funded by the Office of Special Education Programs. And the GTL Center is also funded by both. We're funded by the Office of Special Education Programs, and we're funded by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed. It's actually a great opportunity for us to be dually funded because it allows us to do this kind of cross-pollination in terms of resources and supports with states. But that's where we are funded by those entities. Obviously, each center's mission and charge is fairly somewhat distinct, but as you're seeing, and I think you articulated, Rachel, there's quite a bit of overlap. You well know that we have, with the GTL Center, have been working very closely with the EASN Center in our support around equity. We haven't been working with ESAN necessarily as much around teacher preparation and leader preparation, but I think the window is open now to really start to do that, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to do this webinar, so we could start to make these connections. Does that help, Rachel?
Thank you. Yes, it does. Thank you.
Anyone else? Since we have, just a minute left, I do want to, if there's not any other questions, offer Mary Brownell, I think, Mary, you're still on the phone, an opportunity. Mary, as I mentioned before, is the director of the center and is our leader in helping us figure out the scope of the work that we're doing. And I know we have a number of staff on the phone as well. We have an incredible staff that have really worked hard to engage and work to align a lot of efforts within states. But Mary, I don't know if you wanted to take 30 seconds to say a word or two.
Lynn, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Okay, great. I just want to reinforce a thought when you were talking about the content that we're trying to help preparation providers use with students. A lot of the content that we're providing to the institutions and to the states is really content that's been shown to work with kids who struggle, not just students with disabilities. And so I want to make that clear that the tools that we have are very important for students who are probably scoring at the 40th percentile and below, and also that a lot of kids with disabilities really are not served by teachers who are ready to work with them, and that kind of cuts across socioeconomic and lines, and I think that's really important for people to understand. If people are familiar with the government accountability report that was done a few years ago, most general ed teachers have very little experience working with kids with disabilities before they get to the field. So it shows up. They're not ready to deal with a lot of kids who are struggling either. And so I think the things that we have to offer as a center are important, as you said, Lynn, well beyond special education.
Thanks, Mary. I think you're exactly right. And one of the things I always worry about is when people hear that we're funded by OSEP, that this is just about special ed. And it's so much more than that. And I think that we have learned, and you'll find in those research syntheses that I mentioned before, that many of the strategies that we use for either ELLs or students with disabilities really help all struggling learners. So it would behoove us to really ensure that all teachers are able to implement and these strategies well within our classrooms, and hopefully then we don't have as many students referred to special ed, but we have more students that are being successful because they're getting more quality core instruction. We know
Lynn,
Go ahead.
This is Rachel again. I just want to make one more comment. I'm going to delve into your resources, but light bulb just came on when you were sharing the resources. I see it, really as good resources for closing the achievement gap. The work occurring around turnaround. So I have to delve into it deeper, but I really think that can be a useful resource for some of the turnaround work also.
Oh, you're exactly right, Rachel. As I listen to the turnaround work and the work that we're doing in the GTL Center, I see many connections. And I didn't mention it as explicitly, but we also work on leadership preparation. And in that, we have a couple of resources that highlight what is it that leaders need to be able to know and do to support teachers that support struggling students or students with disabilities. And that's critically important, as you know, in the school turnaround work. Really finding a quality leader is essential, but this also helps think about how are we preparing leaders for the world that they're entering. When you start to take a look at the leadership preparation program, there isn't a whole lot around instruction lessons, and they're starting to grow around instructional leadership. Most particularly students with disabilities, because what it often is a special ed law course. And so I see these as critical strategies. I think it's very easy to think that one of our equitable access strategies is just to pay people more so they'll stay. I personally think that if we prepare teachers better, they're much more likely to stay in the field because they're going to feel successful. So I know that we are 5 minutes over, and I'll apologize up front for that, and I apologize for some of the technical difficulties in the beginning. But hopefully you've seen some of the names of the staff. Many of them are on phone calls today. If you are in a regional center that is an intensive state, we would certainly welcome any opportunity for connection in the work. And even if you aren't, if you're a regional staff that happens to not be an intensive state, I do, as I mentioned before, feel like many of these resources would be quite valuable, and I know any one of us would be more than happy to reach out to you and help you learn about these resources and also and share these resources with your states and then letting them know about them. So with that, I'm going to say thank you to Alex, who also is on the line here with us, talking about the equity work, and thank everybody who's shared their afternoon. Thank you all. We will end. And we will
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lynn.